Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nishant Bhaskar from University of California, San Diego. And today I'm here to present the results of a 19-month-long study in which we tried to evaluate if Bluetooth scanning from a smartphone can be used as a mechanism to detect the presence of payment card skimmers in gas pumps. This work was done in collaboration with Maxwell Bland and Kirill Levchenko at University of Illinois and my advisor, Aaron Schulman. Now, a skimmer is a small electronic device that criminals plant inside payment terminals to record and steal your card data. And if you think about it, the most pervasive form of payment terminals is actually gas pumps. And so, no wonder that the card skimming at gas stations has become a huge problem today. Several skimmers have been recovered in gas stations all across the US, and the numbers are increasing. For instance, in Florida last year, there were 972 gas pump skimmers recovered and 148 in Arizona, which in itself is a 50% increase over the previous year. And the reason for this is because skimming is a very profitable business. A single gas pump skimmer can capture 30 to 100 unique payment cards in just one day of operation, which effectively translates to more than $16 million of estimated fraud from the skimmers recovered in Florida and Arizona, assuming they just operated for one day. So this is a huge number. And so why are these criminals actually targeting gas stations and gas pumps? Simply because gas pumps have really weak physical security. The doors can be opened quite easily using either a crowbar or a universal key. And once the door is open, the card data is transmitted in the clear on the payment circuitry. Add to that the fact that gas stations have really poor video surveillance makes them an ideal target for performing skimming. And so what are these skimming devices that these criminals are using? They are what we call internal gas pump skimmers, a term that was introduced at USENIX security last year. And they are a very basic embedded system. They can be built using off-the-shelf parts. On the top is a photo of a skimmer that was recovered during the course of our study. And as you can see, it's just a microcontroller dev board with an SD card for storage. And this microcontroller dev board can be programmed in Arduino. There are I/O connectors to go to the card reader and the keypad. And criminals also install a Bluetooth to serial module for wirelessly connecting and extracting the stolen data. And the installation procedure of this skimmer is pretty straightforward. All the criminals have to do is basically remove the card reader connection to the payment processor, attach the skimmer in line so that they can passively read the card data every time someone swipes a card, and that's pretty much it. And once this pump door is closed, these things are completely hidden inside. You can't even see them visually. And this whole installation procedure actually can also be done quite quickly. So all the criminals really have to do is basically open the gas pump door. The payment circuitry is right on the door. As you can see, the card reader is on the left and the keypad on the right. The criminal just pops open the card reader cable, attaches the skimmer, attaches a keypad tap, and hides the skimmer neatly in the crevice. And they can do all of this in under 30 seconds, which makes it virtually impossible to detect someone in the act of planting a skimmer. And not only that, once these skimmers are actually installed, it's really hard to detect where these skimmers are at, because just inspecting a bunch of different gas pumps is a very tedious process. There are a lot of gas stations out there, and skimmers are only installed in a small number of them, which basically becomes a needle in a haystack problem. And so, for instance, in Arizona, they did over 7,300 inspections from 2016 to 2018, but could find skimmers in only 1.5% of the cases, which is a lot of wasted effort. And the common detection mechanisms that they use at gas stations for saying if the pump door was open, such as using tamper-proof seals, have been found to be ineffective as well. OK, so now you may think that, you know what, they'll come back to collect their stolen data at some point, right? And so at one of these times, we'll catch them, right? But the problem is that Bluetooth serial module enables them to inconspicuously retrieve the stolen card data. Because all they have to really do is scan for their nearby Bluetooth devices, and then connect to their skimmer and download the card data. And which means that it's really hard to even catch them even downloading the data, because they can do it from the comfort of their vehicle. And so what can we do now, really? I mean, how do we even detect if these things are present? Well, that Bluetooth serial module actually provides us an insight, because if you think about it, if the criminals can scan for these things using their smartphones, then why don't we do the same? It's a neat idea, and looks good. But the thing is, I mean, is that even possible? Can we even like just go around with smartphones and be able to find these skimmers? Does everything look like skimmers? It's not clear at the moment. So can we actually use smartphones to even detect these without opening the gas pumps? And I think the only way to answer this question is just go to a bunch of different gas stations, collect Bluetooth scans, and try to find some skimmers. And so that's exactly what we did. So I'm going to talk about our data collection methodology, in which we designed this custom Bluetooth scanning app called Blutana. And then we use 44 officials from who are basically gas station inspectors, and outfitted them with cheap smartphones and this app to collect Bluetooth scans. And if there were suspect devices, they also inspected the pumps. So I'll talk about the app. The app is basically an Android-based app that uses the Bluetooth device discovery APIs. And it can run on a very inexpensive Android phone. And it records all the Bluetooth scan responses and uploads them to our server for analysis, and also updates the UI with the devices seen. But we needed to actually point out to these gas station inspectors that, hey, there's a suspect device there, right? So we performed this highlighting procedure. And so how do we call something a suspect? So we know that there are these two basic classes of modules that are predominantly found in the skimmers recovered in the field, which are the RN and the HC style modules. And what we did was we looked at their default configurations in Bluetooth, how they look like in Bluetooth scans, and identified 3 parameters by which we can identify them pretty well. The first is the class of device. Now, a class of device actually is a sort of indicator for the intended application of a Bluetooth device. So it will have values like smartphone for a phone, a hands-free for a hands-free thing. But for these Bluetooth modules, the manufacturer actually leaves the class of devices uncategorized. Now, the MAC prefix, or the first 3 bytes of the MAC, indicate the manufacturer. And for RN modules, we saw that they were using the default IEEE MAC prefix. For HC modules, we saw a wide variety of MAC prefixes, and we'll talk about some of them later. Finally, the device names. Now, the module manufacturers assign this sort of a default name, and some actually legitimate products actually use some of these modules. And so what happens is that they change the device name to make it the product identifier. And actually, that's a good piece of information, because we can use that to actually filter out the less suspicious devices. And so that is why, if you see the second device shown in the orange is highlighted in orange because it's a known product, whereas the device on the top is highlighted in red as highly suspicious. And this highlighting procedure is important because it enables our gas station or our data collectors to collect more data. And collecting more data about these skimmers is really useful, because we can use that to do signal strength localization. And that's really a great tool when you're in the field, because the skimmers will have really strong signal near the pumps versus the other devices. And so that can act as a confirmation. In fact, our data collectors never actually opened the pumps to see unless their signal strength was really strong near the pump itself. And as an example, there are 2 devices shown near a gas pump at the same time, and the device on the left has a strong signal and therefore most likely a skimmer. Now, armed with this tool, our data collectors actually went to almost 1,200 gas stations in over 6 states and collected Bluetooth scans. They were able to detect 64 skimmers, and all of these have been now recovered. In this analysis, in the results, we will also talk about 23 additional skimmers which we received from law enforcement for analysis, and we noticed that their Bluetooth properties are very similar to the ones we found in the field. So we're going to talk about basically 2 things. How do these skimmers, how do their Bluetooth properties actually look like, and are they identifiable? And more importantly, what about the rest of the devices? What if everything looks pretty much the same? So the first thing we look at is the class of device for these skimmers, and we saw that all 87 of these skimmers that we recovered had an uncategorized class of device, and which is the default left by the manufacturer. So it seems to be quite a strong property when looking for these skimmers. Now, if we look at the MAC prefixes or the manufacturer, so most skimmers that we saw use the RN module and had the default MAC prefix. The HC modules were kind of interesting because there were a wide variety of MAC prefixes and could not be associated with any manufacturer. And if you see here, there are some of the examples that we have here. But if you look closely, and if you can decompose these MAC first 4 bytes, they actually look like a date stamp. So there's a definite pattern there that we can use. And finally, if you look at the device names, most of the skimmers actually had a default device name, which is the RMBT or HCO5, and that was the case. In certain cases, we saw, as expected, the criminals tried to disguise or customize the device name to make it look benign. But that seemed to have, interestingly, quite a reverse effect, because what happened is that, for example, we saw a phone brand which was an RN module with an uncategorized class of device, and that seemed really suspicious. And in some cases, we actually cannot get the device names, and this is basically an artifact of the Bluetooth scanning mechanism we have, because device names are obtained in subsequent packets, and so we have to rely on the other parameters. The important takeaway from this slide is that these Bluetooth parameters combined actually can identify these skimmers quite well. But this is not that useful unless, because this won't be useful if everything else also looks exactly the same. What if all the skimmers out there basically look like these devices? And so we had to analyze what the other Bluetooth devices seen at gas stations typically look like. And so to do so, we basically took the first visits of every time a gas station was visited the first time, we looked at the number of Bluetooth devices there. And so the one thing that stood out was the fact that there are a lot of Bluetooth devices, as you can see, and there are not that many skimmers. So what are these other 2,500 devices? What do they look like? And so we analyzed the same Bluetooth properties as we did before. And so we start off with the class of device. We see that this is a histogram depicting the distribution or the number of devices in each class of device that we observed. And we saw that there are a lot of devices that are actually uncategorized. While they actually can filter out pretty well amongst the sea of devices, there are still some things which are not skimmers that are uncategorized. So what are these? We dive further into by looking at the MAC prefixes. Now, if you look at the manufacturer distribution, we see, for instance, the RN modules, about half of them were actually seen as skimmers, whereas there were a lot of legitimate products which also use the RN module and can be confused. On the other hand, if you look at the date stamp style MAC addresses, almost all of them were skimmers, but there were this odd device which was not. And finally, there are some other kinds of skimmers that we observed, some MAC prefixes which were seen very rarely across the gas stations, and some MAC prefixes which we have no idea which manufacturer they belong to or they don't follow a pattern. And we saw some skimmers in there as well. Finally, if these MAC prefixes, if we look at how the device name distribution is, that can give us maybe some more clues. And so, for instance, one of the things that was there was there are a lot of legitimate products that use the same modules as are used in skimmers, and we can see that in this bar here. The only skimmers that are there on that bar are the ones wherein, say, the phone brand was an actual product, name of a product, but it was used in a skimmer. For the most part, default device names actually were mostly skimmers, but there were some legitimate applications wherein they left the default device name as the same as the module. There were also some devices in which there were some custom names assigned in which we could not actually figure out what they were, and some of them were skimmers. And finally, there was this large number of devices for which we could not actually figure out the device name. And that's actually a bit of a disadvantage because, as you can see, that less than half of these were actually skimmers. So we have to rely on only the other properties to figure out if these are skimmers or not. But the key takeaway from this analysis is basically the fact that while there are legitimate devices that actually look like skimmers in gas stations, their numbers are quite low. And these properties combined can actually identify these skimmers quite accurately. And so how accurate is that? How effective can this be? So to do that, we did an accuracy analysis of the time that our tool was in deployment in Arizona. And because in Arizona weights and measures, they also do the manual inspection of the gas station, we get a sense of whether it's working or not. And so they detected 42 skimmers during this time, of which we missed only 6. And the more important one is the incorrectly detecting a skimmer. So there were 757 inspections where no skimmers were found. In only 6% of these did we actually detect something as a skimmer, which makes it quite a useful mechanism. So that actually indicates that this Bluetooth scanning can be quite useful, especially considering the amount of time they have to spend on cases wherein there are no skimmers found. Now, there are several countermeasures to this mode of detecting Bluetooth skimmers. Criminals can try switching to BLE, or they can be using a non-discoverable Bluetooth mode in which we can't actually get any device discovery, or they could be trying impersonating any benign devices. And we discussed the cost and responses to this in our paper. But the high-level point here is the fact that while these things can be done by the criminals, there is honestly no incentive for them to actually adapt or change their techniques. Because while we have created a mechanism for gas station inspectors to quickly be able to find skimmers and be able to actually avoid any missed skimmers, the problem is that it's still a needle in a haystack problem. Because of Bluetooth, they have to actually go to the gas station and scan for these skimmers anyways. And so we don't see any incentive for the criminals to actually adapt significantly. Now, finally, we learned some important lessons during the course of this entire study, and about the nature of skimming itself. And so for one thing, we saw that there were several skimmers that were detected at different gas stations which had very close MAC addresses. And by close, I mean the first 5 bytes are the same, and the last byte is differing by some small number. And the thing is that very close MAC addresses are most likely from the same source, which can actually give us an insight into how these criminal gangs operate. So for instance, we saw 2 different devices in the same counties at gas stations separated by 17 miles, which were very close. In another case, we saw 2 different skimmers at 2 gas stations separated, and the gas stations were separated by almost 450 miles. So we see these patterns where criminals are going from one gas station to another in the same county and also moving across several counties. Finally, and this is one of the best results that we got, is that the fact that the gas station inspectors can quickly scan for these devices means that they can actually be doing some other kind of inspection at a gas station, and they could just quickly do a check, and if a suspect device shows up, they can do an inspection. And that is exactly how they did in Arizona. In fact, in several cases, they actually just randomly, they were at a gas station for some other inspection, and they looked at the Bluetooth app. And so what happened is that due to this process, out of the 64, 33 skimmers were recovered simply because they saw something highlighted as suspect device in Bluetooth. So to conclude, we can say that skimmer devices are really detectable in this entire sea of various Bluetooth devices seen at gas stations. And Bluetooth can actually help these inspectors find these skimmers really fast and also help them in avoiding missing skimmers. And fundamentally, what you saw from these slides was that for the most part, criminals are not changing the default properties of the modules because they don't really have to. And so those actual behavior of how these gangs are operating are actually helping us in finding these skimmers. And they may even indicate their source. And one of the last thing I want to end with is the fact that we don't think this problem is going away anytime soon. And to that point, I mean, using Bluetooth, inspectors were able to detect 6 skimmers in the Bay Area at a gas station just last week. And before I end, I would like to thank the various weights and measures inspection agencies who did all this enormous data collection for us, and the law enforcement agencies who actually guided us and provided us an insight into this world of skimming. Thank you.
So thank you for the talk. One question. If you know where a device is, where a skimmer is, why don't you try to find the person installing the skimmer or reading data from the skimmer by just seeing if there is a connect request? I mean, I know it's hard to observe it like just visually, but if you have the signal spectrum and analyze it, you could find the person.
So the way I understand this is you're saying that what if we were to actually be sniffing out there and were to see some sort of a connect request? Is that sort of a thing that you're talking about, like a passive eavesdropping kind of thing?
Exactly.
So one of the things that is there is because the way this skimmer investigation works is that once you actually detect a skimmer, they are to be removed immediately and submitted into evidence. And beyond that, actually, and then the thing is, this idea of actually installing something to actually be looking for all sorts of connect requests is we would have to actually then move on to creating a fake skimmer, which we would have to plant there. And so the thing is, these are the kind of things which actually for the law enforcement agencies do not allow us to do. I understand your point, and it's actually true, but it's something that is not within our purview to actually try and attempt.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, it's Rick Farah. I was wondering if I could get blue tana for myself.
So that's a very good question, and in fact, that's something that a lot of people have actually asked us. So one of the things that, if you have seen from the slides, is one of the reasons why we don't want to outsource this and limit this to only these inspection agencies, is because there are actually legitimate devices at gas stations which can look like skimmers. And so by actually outsourcing it to the public, it can just lead to more sort of panic, because and unlike the gas station inspectors, who if they see something suspect, they just actually do an investigation. They open the skimmer, check the pump, and check if there's a skimmer. And so we want to limit it to that. The other thing why we don't want to crowdsource is because there are these mechanisms by which we highlight devices, and there are these devices which we know are legitimate products. And so actually having the app out there sort of makes it easier for the criminals to sort of reverse engineer and totally change the way they are operating. So there is this sort of anonymity that's helping us. In fact, if we look at Scafie and all paper from Oakland 2019, that's exactly what they did. There were skimmer apps out there in the Play Store. They were able to reverse engineer and figure out what they were doing.
Yeah, we could do it without the app. One comment about your paper, you're off by 2 orders of magnitude. Stolen credit cards in the United States, according to McAfee, are worth $5, not $500.
I'm sorry?
Stolen credit cards in the U.S. on the criminal market, I looked it up while you were talking, $5 each.
So there are 2 aspects to this. So one is actually so if you go on carding forums and try to buy a card, a stolen card, that actually, yes, it's anywhere between $10 and $200, and that depends on, the value of the card is dependent on whether you just have the card info or you have the PIN number and zip code or not. But the values that I'm talking about is the actual money that happens in this value chain is at the cash out. And so what criminals can actually do is cash out these debit and credit cards that they get, and for those, there is a much more value. We have analyzed, in fact, in our paper, we have analyzed that part where we looked at different court documents of skimming cases. We looked at some online reports where they talked about the potential fraud that happens due to cashing out, or the bank and merchant loss. And that number 500 is actually a good middle figure for the various numbers that we observe. And we have done this sort of analysis in the paper in section 2, actually.
Great. Let's thank Nishant.